What if I told you that everything you believed in is a lie? We've grown accustomed to thinking that our ancestors ate nothing but rotten meat and spoiled cabbage. Modern people panic if their refrigerator breaks down for even a couple of hours. We feel that without electricity, any food instantly turns into a biological weapon. But the reality is that medieval people survived for centuries without a single watt of energy. And their food preservation methods weren't just effective, they were truly ingenious. Sounds crazy, right? But let's think about how the survival system actually worked in those harsh times. Winter lasted a long time. The harvest was gathered once a year, and there were simply no supermarkets around the corner. The cost of a mistake in storing provisions wasn't a bad mood, but the starvation of the entire family. That's why peasants and lords had to turn their kitchens into veritable chemistry labs. They invented technologies that modern science could only fully explain centuries later. Today, we rely on complex devices that can break at the slightest power surge. Our food safety system is as fragile as glass and completely dependent on electrical outlets. Medieval culinary engineers, however, relied on simplicity, reliability, and the laws of nature itself. They used basic elements to alter the structure of foods at the molecular level. And the most interesting thing here is that many of these ancient methods work even better than modern refrigerators. Now I'll tell you exactly how they did it. In the harsh Middle Ages, salt was not just a common seasoning to improve the taste of bland soup. It was, in the most literal sense, the fine line between a life of plenty and a painful, slow death from starvation. Modern people casually sprinkle it on French fries without even thinking about its true historical value. In the past, however, bloody wars were waged and entire transcontinental trading empires were built over huge sacks of white crystals. Why was this ordinary mineral so incredibly expensive and valued as highly as pure gold? Because salt possessed a unique, almost magical ability to draw moisture out of absolutely any organic product. In a world without electricity or refrigerators, this property made salt the most important strategic resource on the planet. Without it, any attempt to stockpile provisions was doomed to failure. The mechanism of how salt works at the molecular level seems ridiculously simple, but it is flawless from a biological standpoint. Bacteria, which cause any meat to rot and turn into poison, vitally need water to live comfortably and reproduce. If you completely remove water from the tissues, microorganisms simply cannot survive and function in such a hostile environment. They either die or go into a state of suspended animation, unable to break down the product's structure. Medieval butchers literally buried fresh cuts of pork or beef under a massive, truly colossal amount of salt. This is, in essence, an ancient and highly effective method of complete dehydration, which scientists today call osmosis. Simple peasants didn't know such complex scientific terms, but they understood perfectly well in practice that a piece of well-salted meat was guaranteed to last all winter. The experience of generations served as their chemistry textbooks, allowing them to preserve food under the most unfavorable conditions. Sounds pretty boring, doesn't it? But let's take a look at the numbers together. They'll make you completely rethink the scale of what was happening back then. To properly salt a single adult pig, you needed an amount of salt equal to the entire monthly earnings of an ordinary city artisan. Your current office job requires a degree, years of experience, and yet it often pays less than that salt cost. That is precisely why the annual salting process became a true sacred ritual for every medieval family. The meat was stacked in neat layers in huge wooden barrels, with every millimeter of the surface carefully sprinkled with white crystalline powder. Every pinch counted, because any mistake could ruin the entire precious supply. It was work that required extreme concentration, precision, and physical strength. The barrels were tightly sealed to prevent contact with moist air and pests. My stomach involuntarily cramps at the mere thought of just how extremely salty the final product turned out to be. Try eating a piece of that meat raw, and your kidneys will immediately go into shameful retirement. To make it even remotely chewable and swallowable without harming your health, the salted meat had to be soaked in fresh water for several days in a row. The product regained its shape, releasing excess salt back into the water, and became suitable for heat treatment. But things get even more interesting when we take a closer look at the long sea voyages of that era. Sailors needed food that could lie undisturbed in a damp, dark hold for months without turning into a deadly poison. And this is where extremely harsh salting of fish, especially cod and large northern herring, took center stage. The fish was first dried for a long time in the icy wind, and then generously seasoned with salt until it became as hard as a stone slab. You could literally hammer nails into a ship's mast with this fish, so hard and durable did it become after processing. Yet such fish would not spoil for years, becoming the primary and reliable source of protein for entire vast fleets. It fed explorers and warriors, allowing them to venture far from their native shores. Salt made the ocean navigable, turning ships into self-sufficient fortresses, protected from starvation. Modern serious science fully confirms that such an extreme level of salinity creates an absolutely sterile environment. No dangerous botulism or insidious salmonella can survive and thrive in a piece of meat that is half salt. Today, we spend millions of dollars developing chemical preservatives with complicated names on their labels. Ancient people achieved the same brilliant result using a single, readily available natural mineral. They intuitively understood the physics and chemistry of the process 1,000 years before scientists invented the first microscope. And honestly, this inspires immense, sincere respect for their practical, everyday ingenuity and keen observation. They didn't wait for approval from laboratories. They simply acted based on the results. Sometimes curing methods reach rather strange, almost extreme culinary extremes. In some regions of Europe, meat was rubbed not only with salt, but also with saltpeter to ensure it retained its natural red color. It sounds as if they were seriously planning to turn pork into gunpowder rather than a family dinner. In reality, however, saltpeter helped effectively kill specific bacteria that ordinary salt might accidentally miss. Today, we use sodium nitrite on a massive scale in store-bought sausages for exactly the same technological purposes. The only difference is that we buy it in brightly packaged form at the supermarket, while they extracted saltpeter from ordinary manure. It was a dirty, complicated, but necessary process that ensured food safety. Medieval chemistry was empirical, but it worked no less precisely than modern formulas. Imagine the scale of the entire massive industry that supported this endless process of food preservation. Salt mines across Europe operated nonstop in 3 shifts, while merchants traveled dangerous routes across the entire continent. Without this white powder, the northern countries would simply have perished during the very first harsh and snowy winter. Coal does not protect against decay as reliably as the right preservative does. It was a global system of survival based on very strict calculation and absolute physical necessity. If you have salt in your barn, you have guaranteed food, and thus your tomorrow is secured. If there is no salt, you are doomed to watch in horror as your last supplies turn into disgusting and dangerous rot. Salt was currency, insurance, and a guarantee that spring would find you alive. Interestingly, this time-tested method works flawlessly and predictably even in our high-tech age. You can conduct a simple experiment right in your own kitchen today and see for yourself that medieval methods are correct. Cover a large piece of meat with salt, leave it in a cool place, and it will quickly begin to lose moisture. In a few weeks, you'll have a finished product that doesn't need any electric refrigerator. Of course, your modern wife might not appreciate such daring culinary experiments on a pristine marble countertop. But from a purely scientific standpoint, you've just successfully replicated a brilliant survival trick from our distant ancestors. This is knowledge that requires no wires. It's built into the very nature of things. To briefly summarize this first technology, one thing can be said with complete certainty. Medieval people were not ignorant savages. They never ate spoiled or dangerous food if they had a choice. They were brilliant practitioners who found a reliable way to outwit time itself and the harshness of nature. Salt became their primary strategic weapon in the endless and brutal war against bacteria and starvation. And they won that war every year, without electricity or modern sterile laboratories at their disposal. It was a great victory of pure empirical experience over the ruthless and harsh conditions of the environment. But salt was only the beginning. The next step in the evolution of food preservation was fire and air. If salt was truly the queen of medieval food preservation, then smoking certainly held the king's throne of honor. This method is significantly older than human civilization itself, but it was during the Middle Ages that it reached the level of a true art form. The idea wasn't simply to hold a fatty ham over a fire for a short while to create a pleasant aroma. It was a complex, multi-step chemical process that transformed a perishable product into a durable source of calories. And once again, everything in this system depended on how well people understood the properties of the nature around them. Smoke turned out to be an ideal, nearly airtight barrier between food and the hostile outside world, teeming with microbes. It didn't just alter the taste, it changed the very structure of the food's surface, making it impervious to external attacks. Why does ordinary smoke possess such incredible and powerful preservative properties? The answer lies in a complex cocktail of chemicals released during the very slow smoldering of wood. Formaldehyde, phenols, and various organic acids settle thickly on the surface of the meat, creating an impenetrable toxic film. For most bacteria and small insects, this thin, shiny layer becomes an absolutely deadly barrier. It sounds like a technical description of an industrial poison, but for humans, in small doses, it is completely safe and familiar. Moreover, it is precisely these substances that give the product that very same delightful smoky aroma that we still love and cherish today. Smoking creates a protective coating that simultaneously preserves the product and turns it into a gastronomic masterpiece. But there is one important detail here that makes the entire process truly complex and knowledge-intensive. Not every tree is suitable for smoking supplies over it for weeks on end to prepare for the long winter. If you mistakenly use pine or spruce, the meat will quickly become coated in bitter resin and become completely inedible. Medieval masters knew that only hardwoods were suitable: oak, beech, or aromatic fruit trees. Choosing the right dry log was just as important a decision as choosing a weapon before a decisive battle. A mistake in the firewood meant that your massive winter supply of expensive food would go straight to the trash. The smoker had to know botany as well as an apothecary to avoid ruining the result of his many days of labor. Smoke from different types of wood imparted different flavor notes and varying degrees of protection. The process of true cold smoking took an incredibly long time and required truly angelic patience from the master. The meat was hung as high as possible near the ceiling of a special smokehouse, where thick, cooled smoke flowed in. It hung there for weeks, slowly and evenly, losing its remaining moisture and gradually becoming saturated with protective resins. Modern factories achieve something similar in just a couple of hours using chemical injections. By the standards of the honest Middle Ages, modern technologies would look like a very cheap, harmful, and utterly tasteless imitation. Often, the dwelling itself served as the smokehouse, with smoke from the central hearth rising directly under the roof through the attic. People literally lived in one huge chamber for smoking meat, fish, and even cheese. Your eyes would water every evening from the smoke, but the hams hanging from the ceiling were completely safe from rot. Your modern decorative chimney does exactly one thing. It holds a festive Christmas stocking once a year. The medieval chimney, on the other hand, functioned as a round-the-clock food production factory that was guaranteed to save your life in early spring. Smoke was part of the home's coziness because it signaled the presence of supplies and the absence of future hunger. In distant Iceland, they went even further due to the catastrophic and constant shortage of decent firewood on the island. There simply weren't enough forests to burn scarce oak firewood for weeks on end just for a piece of mutton. So what did the hardy northerners do to avoid starving to death during the long polar winter? They began smoking meat over dried sheep manure, which smoldered very slowly and steadily. It sounds awful to modern ears, but the end product turned out to be completely safe, clean, and perfectly edible. This is a brilliant and vivid example of how humans successfully adapt to any, even the most absurd and harsh environmental conditions. When there is no wood, ingenuity comes into play, along with whatever is right underfoot. The main thing is the result, which allows one to survive in the icy wilderness. Modern biological science has studied meat preserved using these traditional, ancient methods in great detail. It turns out that the smoked layer acts as an almost perfect membrane, completely preventing oxygen from penetrating the fibers. No oxygen means no oxidation of fats, and consequently the product does not become rancid or unpleasant to the taste. Scientists spend years developing complex vacuum packaging to achieve even a slightly similar effect. Ancient peasants simply hung fatty pork over a smoldering pile of sawdust and went to sleep without a care. Sometimes the most elegant and reliable engineering solutions require absolutely no million-dollar budgets or laboratories. It's enough to simply understand the basics of chemistry at a household level and trust the experience of our ancestors. A ham, properly and thoroughly smoked and dried, eventually turned into something resembling a solid wooden club. It could be safely taken on long military campaigns, tossed into a bag without hesitation, and left unconcerned about its preservation in the heat. Roman legionnaires carried wheat with them, while medieval armies relied entirely on dried and smoked meat. It was the ideal field ration, as light as possible in weight and incredibly dense in calories. Modern tourists pay a premium for special freeze-dried meat in bright, crinkly plastic bags. A medieval traveler, on the other hand, would simply cut a piece from a black, smoke-scented ham with a knife and chew it on the go. The energy from this food allowed them to cover dozens of kilometers a day without feeling tired. Many of the ancient recipes that have come down to us require a mandatory combination of both methods for maximum reliability. First, the meat was salted generously and for a long time, a couple of weeks, to completely draw out as much water as possible. Only after this preparation was it sent to the smokehouse for final preservation and flavoring. And most importantly, these proven methods remain fully functional even today, without a single kilowatt of external energy. In the event of a global blackout, a person with their own smokehouse will survive, while the owner of the smartest refrigerator, unfortunately, will not. And to be honest, that sounds a bit frightening and sobering for our pampered, high-tech world. True survival always relies on fire, salt, and knowledge. The following method of preserving food will surely make many modern, pampered people wrinkle their noses in disgust and displeasure. But here's the real deal. Fermentation is probably the most ingenious and significant discovery in the long history of human food. At its core, it is a process of carefully controlled decay that we cleverly harness to our advantage. Instead of fighting the microcosm, our ancestors decided to form a mutually beneficial alliance with it. We deliberately allow certain bacteria, the ones that are beneficial to us, to completely take over the food so that other harmful bacteria simply cannot penetrate it. It sounds like a description of a brutal gang war over territory, only taking place at the microscopic cellular level. And this invisible biological war successfully saved millions of human lives long before the official advent of the first antibiotics. It was the only way to make food safe in a world where hidden contamination lurked everywhere. The classic and most famous example of this technology is ordinary sauerkraut, which has been eaten throughout Europe for centuries. In the fall, entire communities of peasants would chop huge quantities of cabbage, salt it, and pack it tightly into barrels under heavy weights. What happened next inside those dark barrels was a true scientific miracle that people at the time didn't even suspect. Without access to air, an amazing transformation began, altering the very chemical structure of the vegetable. Surprisingly, fermentation didn't just keep the food edible, it made it much more nutritious for the body. Today, modern nutritionists sell probiotics in pharmacies for a fortune, promising people good health and a healthy gut. Medieval people, however, received exactly the same probiotics absolutely free, simply by eating their winter stores every day. Fermentation acted as external digestion, breaking down complex substances into simpler, more accessible ones. Alcohol in those harsh times was also far from just a way to have a fun and lively Friday night. In the Middle Ages, beer and wine were, above all, the most reliable way to preserve calories for a long time and obtain safe drinking water. Plain water in growing cities was often deadly, teeming with bacteria, and could send you to the grave in the blink of an eye. Infections literally swam in every well, turning thirst into a game with death. The fermentation process transformed dirty and suspicious-looking water into a completely safe, high-calorie, and virtually sterile beverage. Beer in those days was brewed very weak, and absolutely everyone drank it without hesitation, even small children, because it was guaranteed to be safe. It was, in essence, an ancient functional energy drink, only without the use of artificial colors or harmful additives. The yeast killed off competitors in the liquid, leaving behind a clean and nutritious product. But let's return to food and take a closer look at cheese, another great masterpiece of ancient fermentation. Fresh raw milk spoils and sours in just a couple of days, and for the average peasant, this was always a serious economic problem. But nature itself provided the solution. A calf's stomach gave humans a special rennet enzyme that caused the milk to quickly curdle into a dense mass. This discovery made it possible to preserve protein and fat in a concentrated form for a very long time. All remaining excess moisture was carefully squeezed out, and the resulting heavy wheel was sent to mature in a deep cave for many months or even years. Hard cheeses, such as classic Parmesan or cheddar, could be stored for an incredibly long time without losing any of their flavor. It was an ideal and ingenious way to transform a perishable liquid into a compact and portable brick of pure life energy. Cheese became a universal currency and the perfect travel ration for travelers and soldiers. Some traditional fermentation methods look today as if someone simply accidentally left their food in damp soil. In Scandinavia, there is still the famous dish surströmming, fermented herring with an incredibly pungent and distinctive odor. The fish was left to ferment in sealed barrels, where over time, it literally swelled from the enormous amount of gases released. Preservation occurred through the creation of a unique microflora that prevented the fish from rotting completely. Today, the pungent smell of this delicacy often causes unprepared modern tourists to flee the room in panic as far as possible. But for the ancient Vikings, it was the only reliable way to preserve fish for a long time without the enormous expense of salt, which was scarce in those parts. They faced a choice between the very strange smell of food and actual starvation during the harsh winter, so the choice was always obvious. Over time, this tradition of survival has turned into an exotic source of national pride, cherished by gourmets. The peasants did not have precise digital thermometers or pH charts at their disposal. They relied solely on the product's smell, color, and centuries of experience. Their senses served as substitutes for complex instruments, allowing them to unerringly determine the stage of readiness. Their unique recipes were passed down strictly from generation to generation, like secret blueprints for survival in a harsh world. If a barrel suddenly began to smell wrong, its entire contents were immediately destroyed without any mercy or hesitation. Natural selection very quickly weeded out those who did not understand the intricacies of microbiology at the household level. A mistake here cost the life not only of the cook, but also of his entire extended family, who depended on these supplies. Vegetables were also regularly and extensively subjected to fermentation and prolonged pickling in a highly acidic environment. Carrots, turnips, onions, all of these were doused in strong vinegar or left to ferment for a long time in their own juices under pressure. Vinegar itself is a product of wine fermentation and always acts as a ruthless and effective killer of any bacteria. This substance was one of the first chemical preservatives widely available to people. To briefly summarize the topic of fermentation, we can confidently say that it was a great partnership between humans and the world of bacteria. Ancient people successfully tamed microbes thousands of years before they officially learned of their actual existence under a microscope. They transformed the dangerous process of decay from a deadly enemy into their most reliable and faithful biological ally. It was not a struggle, but a wise coexistence that bore fruit for both sides. These methods are so effective that many prestigious, world-renowned restaurants are now returning to them en masse in search of new, deep flavors. What was once a harsh necessity for survival in dirt and cold is now exquisitely served on expensive porcelain plates. History has a penchant for such ironic twists, especially when it comes to ways of filling our stomachs. We are once again learning from our ancestors how to transform time and bacteria into an exquisite delicacy. You might mistakenly think that without electricity, people in the past were completely unable to use the power of cold for long-term storage. But this view is fundamentally wrong, because the ground beneath our feet is itself a giant and highly effective natural refrigerator. If you simply dig a pit just a couple of meters deep, the temperature there will remain stable throughout the entire year. The soil acts as a powerful thermal buffer, smoothing out any weather fluctuations above ground. In the summer, such a pit will always be cool, and in the winter, the temperature there will never drop below freezing, reliably preventing food from freezing. Medieval builders and architects were well aware of this useful physical property of the soil and made good use of it. And they utilized this completely free geothermal energy to its fullest potential in every household. A cellar was as essential a part of a home as the roof or the hearth in the center of the hall. Almost every ordinary home of that time had its own deep cellar for storing basic food supplies. These underground rooms were the true beating heart of any medieval household. The walls of such rooms were carefully lined with stone or solid wood to prevent excess soil moisture and pesky rodents from getting inside. The cellar required constant care and ventilation so that the air inside wouldn't stagnate and become musty. Inside the cellar, there were always rows of barrels, heavy hams hanging from the ceiling, and root vegetables lying on the floor, tightly covered with clean, dry sand. The temperature in such a cellar usually remained at an ideal 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. Your modern, expensive refrigerator in the kitchen maintains exactly the same temperature, but it requires monthly utility bills to do so. Our ancestors had the same technology, but it didn't depend on wires or power plants, working forever and without fail. A particular culinary and household trick involved the proper storage of root vegetables, such as turnips, carrots, and beets. Under no circumstances could they simply be dumped into one big pile. Otherwise, they would quickly begin to rot from the moisture they released. Peasants arranged the vegetables in neat layers in wooden boxes and generously covered them with completely dry river sand. The sand served as a natural preservative and insulator, preventing the vegetables from touching one another. From the outside, it looks as though people were simply solemnly burying their food in the sand. But the method worked flawlessly for centuries. It was the simplest and most accessible way to cheat time, preserving vitamins in their original form. But what about real, icy cold in the midst of the hottest summer heat? On truly wealthy estates and in castles, special ice houses were built for this purpose. Very deep wells with incredibly thick stone walls. In winter, sturdy peasants would cut huge blocks of ice from the frozen nearby lakes and rivers, risking falling through the ice. These transparent blocks were carefully lowered into the ice house, stacked tightly and covered with a thick layer of ordinary straw. In this case, the straw acts as an ideal natural insulator, keeping the cold inside and preventing heat from entering. Thanks to this ingenious system, ice could be successfully preserved in the deep underground, even in the height of hot and muggy August. It was a triumph of engineering over the laws of nature, allowing food to be stored at sub-zero temperatures year-round. The ice house was a symbol of the high technological level of agriculture at that time. In the Middle Ages, owning one's own ice house was a sign of incredible wealth and high social status. Only the most noble lords could afford exquisite frozen desserts or pleasantly chilled wine in the midst of a sweltering summer. This required colossal physical effort from an entire army of servants during the winter harvesting season. The ice had to be extracted, transported, and properly stacked, which was back-breaking work in the biting cold. For those who were not wealthy lords, there were simpler but no less ingenious folk methods of cooling food. For example, fresh dairy products and butter were often lowered in buckets on ropes directly into deep, cold wells. The water in such a well always remained icy, and it did an excellent job of drawing excess heat away from perishable, delicate foods. Nature itself provided solutions that lay literally at the feet of every rural resident. The key to this was to secure the lid tightly on the bucket so that no frogs would accidentally fall inside. Some craftsmen built small structures right above flowing streams so that the cold water would constantly cool the stone floor and shelves. This was a brilliant and very economical use of the local landscape, requiring not a single factory-made component. People lived in harmony with the physics of their environment, using its resources for their own comfort. Interestingly, the architecture of these ice houses was thought out by the builders down to the smallest physical details. A special drain for meltwater was always built at the very bottom because water conducts heat much faster than air. If the ice in the well began to float in the water, it melted several times faster, turning into a useless puddle. Proper drainage was a key factor in successfully maintaining the cold for many months. Even entire cheese-making facilities in those days were often built to take advantage of the natural circulation of cold cave air from deep within the earth. In such famous regions as Roquefort in France, prized cheeses are still left to mature exclusively in natural limestone caves. Constant drafts there create ideal humidity and temperature conditions that are virtually impossible to replicate artificially in a laboratory. Stone and wind do the work that powerful climate control systems are responsible for today. Over time, this bog oil acquired a distinctive earthy flavor, yet remained perfectly edible. Archaeologists sometimes find pieces of this oil in peat layers that are several hundred years old, and they are still technically edible. It turns out that a bog is not just mud and danger, but also an excellent preservative, a gift from nature itself. People knew where to hide their breakfast so that it would wait for them safe and sound. Ancient cellars and ice houses clearly show us that our ancestors knew how to work with the environment in a masterful way. They never tried to brutally conquer nature, as we often do today with the help of complex technologies. They observed it closely and wisely used its own laws for their daily survival. The underground cold was a free, eternal, and absolutely reliable resource for them every harsh winter and hot summer. If electricity were to suddenly disappear worldwide tomorrow, the owners of deep stone cellars wouldn't even notice a difference in their daily lives. They would simply go down the stairs as usual and fetch their fresh carrots, just as their great-grandfathers did hundreds of years ago. This self-sufficiency and simplicity command deep respect in our age of fragile and dependent technologies. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones right under our feet, in the cool silence of our native soil. We've reached the most unusual yet incredibly effective methods of food preservation. And taking the top spot here is a technique that would make cardiologists clutch their hearts in alarm. We're talking about preserving meat in its own thick, heavy fat. The French elevated this method to an art form, creating the famous dish known as confit. The essence of the method is frighteningly simple. You simmer the meat for a long time, then cover it with fat right to the brim. When the fat solidifies, it forms an impenetrable concrete wall against any microbes. Air is food's greatest enemy because oxygen triggers oxidation and carries bacteria. The solidified fat completely blocks oxygen's access to the tender meat fibers. A pot containing such meat could safely sit in a cool place for anywhere from several months to a year. Before eating, the pot was simply reheated, the fat melted, and the meat became tender again. It was the perfect medieval preserve, only instead of tin, they used ceramics and lard. Your liver might have been unhappy, but at least you certainly didn't starve to death. Surprisingly, honey worked on exactly the same principle of preservation, only for sweet foods. Honey is a unique substance that practically never spoils thanks to its composition. It contains so little water and so much sugar that bacteria literally dry up alive in it. Fruits, berries, and even nuts were doused in honey, preserving them for the long winter months. Archaeologists have found jars of honey in Egyptian pyramids that were still edible thousands of years later. It is the perfect natural preservative, created by bees for their own needs. Some Native American tribes used a similar principle to create the famous pemmican. They took meat dried into a powder, mixed it with dried berries, and poured melted fat over it. The result was an incredibly dense briquette that didn't spoil for years in any weather conditions. Pemmican was so effective that it later became a staple of European polar explorers' diets. It was an ancient protein bar containing thousands of calories in a small piece. Modern hikers can only dream of such energy density in their backpacks. Sealing wasn't limited to using fat or sweet honey. To protect cheeses from drying out and mold, they were often coated with a thick layer of wax. The wax was melted, the cheese wheel dipped into it, and it received a perfect protective capsule. This method is still used today. Take a look at the shelves of high-end supermarkets. The wax allows the cheese to breathe, but keeps harmful spores from the air out. Medieval farmers understood perfectly well that packaging is just as important as the product itself. Another interesting method of preservation involves storing eggs, which also spoil quickly. Hens lay eggs actively only in the summer, and in the winter, eggs became extremely rare. To preserve them, farmers coated the shells with lard, clay, or even slaked lime. This coating sealed the microscopic pores on the shell, preventing the egg from drying out and spoiling. Sometimes eggs were simply buried in wood ash, which acted as an antiseptic and insulator. In this way, a summer product could last until Christmas without a refrigerator. If we look at baked goods, sealing worked a little differently here. Medieval pies were often baked in a hard, inedible crust made of flour and water. This crust was not meant to be eaten, but served as a disposable mold for baking and storing the filling. Inside the stone-hard shell, meat and vegetables could be stored for several days without spoiling. People would simply open the crust like a modern can, eat the filling, and throw the dough to the dogs. It was the world's first eco-friendly disposable fast food packaging. Sausages are also a brilliant example of insulation and waste-free production. Cleaned animal intestines served as the perfect casing for minced meat mixed with spices and salt. The casing protected the contents, and hanging the sausages in a smokehouse completed the preservation process. Not a single part of a slaughtered animal went to waste. Everything was put to use. Butchers made sausages, and they were all true medieval engineers. It sounds boring, but it was precisely these unassuming technologies that fed entire continents. It's also worth mentioning the use of olive oil in Southern Europe. What Northerners did with lard, Italians and Greeks did with oil. Herbs, garlic, cheese, and vegetables were completely submerged in jars of the highest quality oil. The oil blocked out oxygen, and the food imparted its aroma to the oil, making it even more flavorful. It was a perfect symbiosis, where the preservative became just as valuable as the food itself. And this method has survived to this day, virtually unchanged in every Mediterranean cuisine. Fat, honey, and oil prove that our ancestors knew how to create impermeable barriers. They didn't know about the existence of oxygen as a chemical element, but they understood its destructive power. Their sealing methods were natural, cheap, and 100% effective. In a world without plastic or vacuum sealers, nature itself provided all the packaging materials. And most importantly, this type of packaging never polluted the oceans and was easily consumed or recycled. The modern packaging industry has much to learn from these simple peasant solutions. Summing up this journey into the past, one thing becomes absolutely clear. Medieval people were not helpless victims of circumstance, as they are often portrayed in movies. They were incredibly inventive technologists, working with the materials that nature provided them. They learned to control chemical reactions, humidity, temperature, and even colonies of microorganisms. And they did all this without a single scientific instrument, relying solely on centuries of practical experience. Their survival systems were built on the fundamental laws of physics and biology. Today we laugh at their primitive tools and rough way of life, but our modern methods often fall short of these ancient technologies in terms of reliability. If the power grid collapses tomorrow, our supermarkets will turn into dumps of rotting food within 3 days. But a barrel of salted cod or a pot of meat and fat will easily last another couple of years. Modern science merely confirms what ancient butchers and farmers knew on an intuitive level. Sometimes the most advanced knowledge is simply well-forgotten old secrets.